A crisp, fall breeze swept through the halls of Parkside Middle School as students shuffled in, their footsteps echoing on the tile floor. The smell of fresh pencils and paper lingered in the air. A new school year had begun. For 13-year-old Nia, it was her first day back, and though she was usually excited about school, today she felt a knot of unease in her stomach. Nia had always loved her big, natural curls, the way they bounced around her face and seemed to have a life of their own. Her mom called her hair her crown, and it made her feel proud. But in some places, like this school, that pride sometimes brought stares or whispers. And it wasn't just her hair. Her smooth, dark skin often set her apart from the rest of her classmates. This hadn't bothered her much in the past, but last year things had begun to change. As she walked into her homeroom, Ms. Gilmore, her teacher from last year, was standing near the blackboard. Ms. Gilmore's eyes narrowed slightly as they landed on Nia, a look that Nia was sadly familiar with. Her teacher never said anything directly, but it was as if her gaze alone questioned Nia's every move, making her feel self-conscious and out of place. "Good morning, everyone," Ms. Gilmore announced, her voice high-pitched and formal. She then glanced down at the attendance list, reading off names with mechanical precision. "Nia Watkins," she called, her tone suddenly dipping as her eyes rested on Nia's seat near the back. "Yes, ma'am," Nia replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Ms. Gilmore's gaze lingered for a moment before moving on, but Nia could feel the chill of that stare long after. She shifted uncomfortably, trying to focus on the lesson, but Ms. Gilmore's voice kept piercing her thoughts. Halfway through the lesson, Ms. Gilmore stopped and turned, her eyes scanning the room. "Class, I want you all to take out a piece of paper and write down what a professional appearance means to you. It's important to understand what's acceptable in formal environments." Nia fumbled in her backpack for a paper, wondering why they were doing this activity so early in the year. Her classmates started writing eagerly, but she could feel Ms. Gilmore's eyes on her, and a wave of discomfort washed over her. "Nia," Ms. Gilmore's voice cut through the quiet murmurs of the classroom, "would you mind coming to the front of the class?" Nia's stomach tightened, but she slowly rose, clutching her notebook. She felt every pair of eyes in the room turn to her, curiosity and confusion swirling in the air. Ms. Gilmore gestured for her to stand in front of the class. "This, class, is an example," Ms. Gilmore began, her tone dripping with a condescending edge, "of what you might see outside of a formal or professional setting." Her gaze swept over Nia's hair and outfit, jeans and a cozy sweater, before continuing, "Now, Nia, how do you think your appearance aligns with what's acceptable in a professional environment?" Nia's face burned, her hands trembling slightly. She looked around, hoping someone would say something, but her classmates only looked back at her with pity or surprise. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. I think I look fine, Ms. Gilmore." Ms. Gilmore's lips twisted into a thin smile. "Well, fine might be okay for some situations, but a professional appearance is very different. In certain settings, people might not think, big hair like that," she said with a pointed look, "fits the standard." The quiet gasps from the other students filled the room, and Nia's heart sank. She wanted to disappear, to slip through the floor and out of sight. It was only the first day, and already Ms. Gilmore was making her feel like an outsider, like she didn't belong. In the back of the room, Mateo, one of Nia's classmates, clenched his fists. He had seen how Ms. Gilmore treated Nia last year, too. He had been too scared to speak up before, but seeing his friend humiliated in front of everyone made something snap inside him. "Ms. Gilmore," he called out, his voice steady and strong. "What does Nia's hair have to do with her being smart or kind or good at school?" The room fell silent as Ms. Gilmore turned to him, her expression one of surprise and irritation. "Excuse me, Mateo," she said, arching an eyebrow. "Are you questioning my lesson?" "Yes," he replied, not backing down. "You said we're supposed to talk about being professional, but it sounds like you're just picking on Nia for no reason." A few students murmured in agreement, their eyes flicking between Mateo and Ms. Gilmore, excitement and fear mingling on their faces. Ms. Gilmore's face turned a shade of red as she stared at Mateo, clearly not used to being challenged. "Mateo, this is not your concern," she said, her voice ice cold. "If you have something to say, I suggest you raise your hand at an appropriate time." He shrugged defiantly. "Well, someone has to say it." Ms. Gilmore's jaw clenched, but before she could respond, the bell rang, signaling the end of class. Nia, still feeling humiliated and shaken, grabbed her things and darted out of the room, her heart pounding as she navigated the crowded hallways. She didn't know where she was going, but she needed to get away from that classroom, from the judgment and the stares. Mateo caught up with her in the hallway, his expression sympathetic. "I'm sorry, Nia," he said quietly. She was way out of line. Nia looked up at him, managing a small, grateful smile. "Thanks, Mateo. That meant a lot. I didn't know what to say." Mateo shrugged. "She shouldn't have treated you like that. Nobody should." Just then, another teacher, Ms. Jacobs, walked by and noticed Nia's distressed expression. She paused, her face filling with concern. "Are you okay, Nia?" she asked gently. Nia hesitated but eventually nodded. "Yeah, Ms. Jacobs. I'm fine." Ms. Jacobs looked unconvinced, glancing between Nia and Mateo. "If something's wrong, you know you can come to me, right? I'm here to help." Nia nodded again, feeling a glimmer of hope. Maybe there were teachers who cared, who would stand up for her if she found the courage to tell them what was happening. She wasn't sure what she'd do next, but for now, she was grateful for the small show of support. As they walked down the hallway together, Nia could feel a fire growing inside her, one she hadn't felt before. She wasn't sure how, but she knew she wasn't going to let Ms. Gilmore keep making her feel like this. It was time to stand up, not just for herself, but for anyone else who felt like they didn't belong. As the days passed, Ms. Gilmore's attitude toward Nia didn't improve. If anything, her words and actions became more pointed, leaving Nia feeling isolated and constantly on edge. It wasn't just the subtle glances or condescending remarks anymore. Ms. Gilmore's actions had begun to affect Nia's schoolwork. Whenever Nia raised her hand to answer a question, Ms. Gilmore would ignore her or roll her eyes, moving on to another student without even acknowledging her. One morning, Ms. Gilmore announced a pop quiz in English, and Nia felt a surge of confidence. English was her favorite subject, and she knew the material inside and out. But as Ms. Gilmore handed out the quizzes, she paused at Nia's desk, placing the paper down with a smirk. "Let's see if that hair holds any wisdom," she murmured just loud enough for Nia to hear. Nia's hands clenched around her pencil, her vision blurring with frustration and hurt. But she forced herself to ignore the comment, focusing on the quiz. When she finished, she felt good about her answers. She knew she had done well. But when Ms. Gilmore returned the graded quizzes the next day, Nia's heart sank. A large red D was scribbled across the top of her paper. She flipped through the pages, her heart pounding as she realized that many of her correct answers had been marked wrong. It didn't make any sense. She had checked her answers carefully. Feeling a surge of frustration, Nia raised her hand. "Ms. Gilmore, I think there's a mistake on my quiz. Some of the answers marked wrong are actually correct." Ms. Gilmore's gaze was icy as she approached Nia's desk. "Are you questioning my grading, Nia?" she asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Nia swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice steady. I studied hard, and I think I did better than AD." Ms. Gilmore leaned in close, her voice low so only Nia could hear. "Maybe you did, for someone like you. But maybe you just need to accept that your best isn't good enough in my class." A wave of anger and humiliation washed over Nia. She wanted to scream, to tell Ms. Gilmore how unfair she was being, but she felt paralyzed by the teacher's steely gaze. The weight of Ms. Gilmore's words pressed down on her, making her feel small and powerless. At lunch, Nia sat alone, her mind racing as she replayed the events in her head. The unfair grade, the whispers, the way Ms. Gilmore looked at her as if she didn't belong. She could feel her frustration building, and for the first time, she thought about telling someone what was happening. Just then, Mateo and a few other friends joined her at the table. "Nia, you okay?" Mateo asked, his brow furrowed in concern. She looked at him, trying to keep her composure. "I got a D on the quiz. But I know I did better than that, Mateo." She marked answers wrong that were correct. "I just don't understand why she's doing this to me." Mateo's jaw clenched, his eyes flashing with anger. "She's doing it because she's a bully, Nia. She's trying to make you feel like you're not good enough, but don't believe her. You're smart, and you deserve to be here just as much as anyone else." Nia managed a small smile, grateful for her friend's support. But deep down, she knew that if she didn't speak up, Ms. Gilmore would keep making her life difficult. She had tried to ignore it, hoping it would go away, but it was clear that Ms. Gilmore had no intention of letting up. After school, Nia decided to stay back and wait outside Ms. Jacobs's classroom. Ms. Jacobs had always been kind to her, and Nia hoped she would understand. As she stood by the door, she hesitated, wondering if she was making a mistake. But just as she was about to leave, Ms. Jacobs walked out and spotted her. "Nia, is everything okay?" Ms. Jacobs asked, her voice warm and encouraging. Nia took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Actually, Ms. Jacobs, I wanted to talk to you about something. It's about Ms. Gilmore." Ms. Jacobs's smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of concern. "Of course, Nia. Let's go back into the classroom where we can talk privately." Once inside, Nia recounted everything that had been happening, how Ms. Gilmore humiliated her in front of the class, the way she marked her answers wrong on purpose, and the constant insults about her appearance. As she spoke, Ms. Jacobs listened intently, her expression growing more serious with each detail. When Nia finished, Ms. Jacobs placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Nia, thank you for telling me. What Ms. Gilmore is doing is unacceptable, and it takes courage to speak up. I'll make sure this is looked into." For the first time in weeks, Nia felt a flicker of hope. Ms. Jacobs promised to take her concerns to the principal, Mr. Campbell, and assured her that she wasn't alone. Nia left school that day feeling lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. But the relief didn't last long. The next morning, as she entered Ms. Gilmore's classroom, she could tell something was different. Ms. Gilmore's smile was colder than usual, her gaze sharper. It was as if she knew that Nia had spoken up, and the thought sent a chill down Nia's spine. Halfway through the lesson, Ms. Gilmore assigned the class a group project. As she handed out the instructions, she stopped in front of Nia, her voice low and mocking. "I hope you can handle this assignment, Nia. It requires a lot of attention to detail." Nia bit her lip, resisting the urge to respond. She knew Ms. Gilmore was baiting her, trying to provoke her into reacting. But Nia refused to give her the satisfaction. During the project work, Ms. Gilmore walked around the room, watching each group carefully. When she reached Nia's group, she made a point of scrutinizing Nia's work, her gaze lingering as if she were looking for something to criticize. "This isn't right," Ms. Gilmore said, pointing at Nia's notes with a frown. "I expected better from you." Nia's friends exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the tension. But before anyone could respond, Ms. Gilmore moved on, her expression smug. The final straw came when Nia accidentally dropped her pencil. As she bent down to pick it up, she heard Ms. Gilmore mutter under her breath, "No wonder she's always behind." The comment was quiet enough that most of the class didn't hear it, but Nia did. Her hands clenched into fists as she fought back tears of frustration. She had never felt so humiliated in her life, and the worst part was that she felt powerless to stop it. But Nia wasn't alone. Unbeknownst to her, several of her classmates had noticed Ms. Gilmore's behavior. They could see the way she targeted Nia, the way she seemed to go out of her way to make her feel unwelcome. And slowly, a sense of solidarity began to build among them. They didn't know exactly what they would do yet, but they were determined to find a way to support Nia and stand up to Ms. Gilmore's unfair treatment. Days turned into weeks, and the situation with Ms. Gilmore continued to escalate. Nia did her best to stay focused, but each day felt like a test of her patience and resilience. Every little mistake, every slight misstep, seemed to be another excuse for Ms. Gilmore to make an example of her. Nia tried to brush it off, reminding herself that she was stronger than this, but the constant scrutiny and belittling comments chipped away at her confidence. One morning, as Nia entered the classroom, she could already feel the tension in the air. Ms. Gilmore was writing something on the board with a focused, almost predatory look. Today's assignment was a presentation on a historical figure who had made a positive impact in the world. Students could choose anyone they admired, but they had to present not just facts but explain why they found this person inspiring. Nia's mind raced. She had already prepared her presentation on Maya Angelou, her mother's favorite poet. She admired Maya Angelou's courage, resilience, and unapologetic sense of identity. As Nia set up her notes, she could feel her classmates' support in subtle glances and nods. Mateo, seated nearby, gave her an encouraging thumbs up. She was ready for this. As Ms. Gilmore called Nia's name, a faint smirk crossed her face, as if anticipating some flaw in Nia's presentation. Nia took a deep breath, stood up, and moved to the front of the classroom. She felt a slight quiver in her hands but forced herself to focus on the words she had written and practiced the night before. Maya Angelou was a writer, poet, and civil rights activist, Nia began, her voice steady. She taught people to embrace who they are and to rise above prejudice. Her famous words, "I am the dream and the hope of the slave," remind us of the strength and resilience that come from embracing our true selves, despite what society may think or expect. The room was silent as Nia spoke, her voice growing more confident with each word. She felt empowered, as though Maya Angelou's spirit was with her, guiding her through this moment. As she wrapped up her presentation, a few classmates even clapped, and Nia felt a surge of pride. She had done it. But Ms. Gilmore's expression was far from pleased. Her eyes narrowed, and she gave a slow, sarcastic clap. "Interesting choice, Nia," she said with a cold smile. "But don't you think someone more relatable might have been a better pick? Someone whose values fit with the kind of excellence we expect here at Parkside?" A murmur of disapproval rippled through the classroom. Nia's cheeks flushed, but she held her ground, looking directly at Ms. Gilmore. "I think Maya Angelou's message of strength and pride in who you are is exactly what students need to hear. It's about finding your voice and standing up for yourself." Ms. Gilmore's face hardened. "Maybe that's true for some people," she replied, her tone laced with disdain. "But some people might do better focusing on fitting in and following the rules instead of standing out for the wrong reasons." This was the first time Ms. Gilmore had been so blatant, and the class sensed the hostility radiating from her words. Mateo's hand shot up, his face etched with determination. "Ms. Gilmore, why is being yourself considered the wrong reason?" Ms. Gilmore shot him a sharp glare, clearly irritated by his interruption. "Mateo, this discussion is between Nia and me. If you're having trouble understanding the assignment, perhaps you should focus on that instead." Mateo shook his head, undeterred. "I understand the assignment just fine. What I don't understand is why you keep picking on Nia. She's done everything right. We all see it. You keep making it about her hair, her skin, or the way she speaks. It's not fair, and we all know it." A few other students nodded, murmuring in agreement. Ms. Gilmore's face turned red, and she looked taken aback by the show of support for Nia. For a moment, she seemed at a loss for words, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to regain control of the classroom. "That's enough," she said finally, her voice shaking with anger. "If you all spent half as much time on your studies as you do meddling in things that don't concern you, perhaps we'd have fewer distractions in class." Mateo didn't back down. "It concerns us because it's wrong. We're here to learn, not to be judged based on what we look like." Ms. Gilmore clenched her jaw, her eyes narrowing as she looked at Nia. "Nia, I suggest you sit down before you get yourself into more trouble. And the rest of you would do well to remember that this is my classroom. I won't tolerate this kind of disrespect." Nia's hands shook as she returned to her seat, her heart pounding. She was grateful for her classmates' support, but Ms. Gilmore's glare made her feel like she was back at square one, small and powerless under her scrutiny. She knew Ms. Gilmore wouldn't forget this challenge, and she worried about what would happen next. As the class ended, Ms. Jacobs appeared at the door, her face clouded with concern. She had heard from Mr. Campbell that Ms. Gilmore was being investigated, but after the latest reports from students and other teachers, Ms. Jacobs had felt the need to check in on Nia. "Nia, could I see you for a moment?" Ms. Jacobs asked, her voice gentle yet serious. Ms. Gilmore's eyes flashed with annoyance as she watched Nia follow Ms. Jacobs into the hallway. "Don't think this is over," she muttered under her breath. In the hallway, Ms. Jacobs knelt down to Nia's level, her gaze kind but filled with concern. "Nia, I heard about what happened. I know this is hard, and it's taking a lot of strength to keep standing up for yourself. You have so many people who believe in you and who see what's going on." Nia swallowed, nodding as she held back tears. She wanted to stay strong, but the pressure and constant harassment were wearing her down. "Ms. Jacobs, I'm just tired. I don't know if I can keep dealing with this every day." Ms. Jacobs placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone, Nia. There are adults here who want to help you, and you have friends who are willing to stand up with you. Mr. Campbell is aware of what's happening, and he's looking into it. In the meantime, remember that your voice matters." With that encouragement, Nia felt a renewed sense of hope. She realized that standing up for herself might not be easy, but she wasn't as powerless as she had once thought. Her classmates' support and Ms. Jacobs's kindness gave her the courage to keep going, even as she knew the road ahead might still be difficult. As she walked back to class, she passed Mateo and her friends, who gave her a small nod of encouragement. They had her back, and together, they would find a way to get through this. Nia's journey wasn't over yet, and while the path ahead was uncertain, she was ready to face whatever came next. Nia returned to class with a sense of resolve, buoyed by the support of her classmates and the comforting words of Ms. Jacobs. But as the days passed, it became clear that Ms. Gilmore wasn't going to back down. If anything, her demeanor became even colder, her remarks sharper. It was as though Ms. Gilmore saw Nia's small acts of resistance as a challenge, one she intended to crush. The next big incident happened during a group discussion day in class. Ms. Gilmore had paired up students at random, claiming it would encourage them to interact with classmates they didn't normally work with. Nia found herself partnered with Claire, a quiet but intelligent girl who always kept her head down in class. As they worked through the questions Ms. Gilmore had assigned, Nia noticed Claire's nervous glances toward the front of the room. "Is everything okay?" Nia asked, noticing Claire's fidgeting. Claire hesitated, looking at Nia with wide eyes. I don't want to get on her bad side. She's been really tough on you, and I don't want her to treat me the same way." Nia's heart sank. It wasn't just her who was feeling the effects of Ms. Gilmore's behavior. Her classmates were fearful too, worried that standing up for themselves or others would make them a target. Nia wanted to tell Claire that everything would be fine, that Ms. Gilmore would eventually face consequences, but she couldn't find the words. Just as they finished the assignment, Ms. Gilmore approached their table, her expression cold and scrutinizing. She picked up their work, her eyes scanning the page before she looked at Nia with a smirk. Is this really the best you can do, Nia? She sneered. I expected more from someone who claims to care so much about education and self-expression. This is sloppy work. Do it over. Nia's jaw clenched, but she kept her voice steady. I thought we did a good job. We answered all the questions you gave us. Ms. Gilmore's eyes narrowed. Clearly, you're not familiar with what good work looks like. And Claire, I would think twice about who you partner with if you want to succeed in this class. Claire's face paled, her hands twisting in her lap. Nia could feel the anger boiling inside her. She wanted to defend herself and Claire, to tell Ms. Gilmore that her actions were unfair and damaging, but she knew it would only make things worse in the moment. After school, Nia found herself surrounded by her friends in the cafeteria. Mateo, who had been watching the exchange from across the room, looked furious. This is getting out of hand, Nia, he said. She's not just targeting you now, she's making everyone afraid. We can't just sit back and let her get away with this. Nia nodded, the weight of the situation settling heavily on her shoulders. I know, but I don't know what else to do. I've talked to Ms. Jacobs, and she promised to help, but nothing seems to be changing. Mateo leaned forward, his eyes full of determination. Then we need to make a statement. Something that shows everyone what's going on so they can't ignore it. We need to make it so public that they have no choice but to take action. The idea intrigued Nia, though she was cautious. Making a public statement would mean putting herself and her friends in the spotlight, and the risk of backlash was high. But as she looked around at her friends' determined faces, she realized that they were willing to stand by her, no matter what. The plan they came up with was simple but powerful. They would write an open letter detailing Ms. Gilmore's behavior, signed by everyone who had witnessed or experienced her discrimination. They would submit it to the school administration, and if necessary, they'd post it online. They wanted to make sure that the voices of those affected would be heard loud and clear. Over the next few days, Nia and her friends worked tirelessly on the letter. They included detailed accounts of incidents they had witnessed, carefully describing Ms. Gilmore's words and actions. They didn't exaggerate or embellish, they simply told the truth, trusting that the reality of the situation would speak for itself. Each of them signed their names at the bottom, a show of solidarity that made Nia feel stronger than she had in weeks. When the letter was finally finished, they presented it to Mr. Campbell, the principal. He was taken aback, his face turning serious as he read through the accounts. He thanked them for bringing the issue to his attention and promised to investigate thoroughly. But even as they left his office, Nia could feel the tension building. The letter was only the beginning. She knew that Ms. Gilmore wouldn't take this quietly, and she braced herself for whatever backlash might come. The following day, as they walked into English class, Nia and her friends noticed Ms. Gilmore's expression was colder than ever. She looked at them with a steely glint in her eye, as if daring them to speak up again. The air felt thick with unspoken words, and a heavy silence settled over the room as class began. Midway through the lesson, Ms. Gilmore paused, her gaze sweeping over the classroom. It's come to my attention that some students here feel they're being treated unfairly, she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. I'd like to remind everyone that my standards are high, and not everyone is equipped to meet them. Perhaps instead of complaining, certain individuals should focus on improving themselves. The word stung, and Nia could feel her classmates' eyes on her, waiting to see how she would react. She clenched her fists, determined not to give Ms. Gilmore the satisfaction of a reaction. She knew that responding would only play into her hands, giving her more ammunition to use against them. But Mateo, sitting beside her, wasn't as restrained. He raised his hand, his voice steady but defiant. Ms. Gilmore, I don't think it's about not meeting your standards. I think it's about respect. We're here to learn, not to be belittled or singled out. Ms. Gilmore's face twisted with anger. Enough, Mateo. If you're not interested in my class, you're welcome to leave. Mateo stood his ground. I am interested, Ms. Gilmore. I just think we deserve the same respect you expect from us. The room was silent, everyone holding their breath as they watched the standoff unfold. Ms. Gilmore's eyes blazed with fury, and for a moment, it looked as though she might actually lose control. But instead, she took a deep breath, forcing a cold smile onto her face. If that's how you feel, Mateo, perhaps you and your friends should consider transferring to a class more suited to your capabilities. Nia could feel her heart pounding, her anger and frustration boiling over. She wanted to stand up and shout, to tell Ms. Gilmore that they weren't going to take it anymore. But she knew that a public outburst wouldn't help their cause. They had to be strategic, to show the administration just how serious the situation was. When class finally ended, Nia and her friends gathered in the hallway, their faces set with determination. They knew they were in for a fight, but they were ready. They would continue to raise their voices, to speak out against Ms. Gilmore's treatment, and to stand up for the respect and dignity they deserved. The days that followed were tense. Nia could feel the weight of their decision pressing on her, but each look of encouragement from her classmates bolstered her resolve. It was as if an unspoken pact had been made, a pact to stand strong together and resist the constant pressure Ms. Gilmore applied on them. The letter they had submitted to Mr. Campbell was now public knowledge, and rumors spread quickly through the school. Some students whispered about the group's courage, while others were simply shocked that they dared to go up against a teacher with Ms. Gilmore's reputation. Ms. Gilmore, however, made her displeasure known in every subtle way she could. She piled on extra homework, ignored requests for help, and sneered at the slightest mistakes. It was as if she was trying to exhaust their spirits, one small slight at a time. But every time Nia felt the frustration and fatigue clawing at her, she reminded herself of why she was standing up and the people supporting her. One morning, Nia arrived in class to find Ms. Gilmore waiting for her with a thinly veiled smirk. "Nia, could I see you after class?" she said, her voice carrying a note of anticipation that made Nia's stomach twist. She had learned to expect that any one-on-one encounter with Ms. Gilmore would not end in her favor, and today seemed no different. The class dragged by, Ms. Gilmore casting frequent, pointed glances in Nia's direction, as though she were mentally calculating how best to confront her. When the bell rang, Nia's friends shot her worried looks, and Mateo gave her a small nod of encouragement. "Stay strong," he whispered, as they filed out of the room. Once the classroom had emptied, Ms. Gilmore crossed her arms and fixed Nia with an icy stare. "I'm disappointed, Nia," she began, her voice heavy with disdain. "I thought you were smart enough to understand the value of a good education. But instead of focusing on your work, you've chosen to waste your time causing trouble." Nia took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I'm not trying to cause trouble, Ms. Gilmore. I'm just standing up for what's right. We all deserve to be treated with respect." Ms. Gilmore's eyes narrowed, her face darkening. "Respect, Nia. Respect is earned, not handed out freely. And judging by your performance in this class, you still have a long way to go." Nia felt her hands clench, but she kept her voice calm. "Respect should be mutual, Ms. Gilmore. It's not fair to judge someone based on their skin color or their background." Ms. Gilmore's mouth twisted into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, I see. You think this is about race? Well, let me assure you, Nia, I don't care what color you are. I care about the quality of work you produce, and frankly, you've been slipping." The accusation stung, but Nia refused to let it show. She had been putting extra effort into every assignment, knowing that Ms. Gilmore would scrutinize her work more closely than anyone else's. "I know I'm doing my best," she replied firmly. Ms. Gilmore's gaze grew colder, and she leaned in, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Let me give you a piece of advice, Nia. If you keep this up, you'll find that life isn't as forgiving as you think. People like you need to work twice as hard to get half as far. I would think twice before making things harder for yourself." Nia felt the weight of Ms. Gilmore's words, but she refused to let them shake her. "Thank you for the advice, Ms. Gilmore," she said, her voice steady. "But I believe that people can succeed when they believe in themselves and fight for what's right." The silence stretched between them, tense and charged. Ms. Gilmore's face twisted with irritation, and she turned away dismissively. "Get back to class, Nia," she said. "And remember what I said. Keep pushing your luck, and it will eventually run out." As Nia walked out of the room, her mind buzzed with anger and frustration. She knew Ms. Gilmore's words were meant to intimidate her, to make her feel small and powerless. But instead, they only strengthened her resolve. She wasn't going to back down, not after coming this far. The news of her confrontation with Ms. Gilmore spread quickly among her friends, and by the end of the day, everyone seemed to be talking about it. Mateo approached her at lunch, his eyes full of admiration. "You're stronger than most people I know, Nia. She's trying to break you, but you're still standing." Nia nodded, though her shoulders felt heavy. "It's hard, Mateo. She's not backing down, and I don't know how long I can keep doing this. But I don't want to give her the satisfaction of winning." Mateo put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone in this. We're all here for you. And if she thinks we're going to let her get away with this, she's in for a surprise." Over the following days, their resolve was put to the test. Ms. Gilmore began to make life increasingly difficult for anyone who had supported Nia, going out of her way to mark their work more harshly and calling them out for the smallest mistakes. The pressure weighed on all of them, and at times, it felt like they were fighting an uphill battle. But even as Ms. Gilmore tried to tighten her grip, the group's determination only grew stronger. They began to meet after school to share their experiences, supporting each other through the challenges they faced. Mateo had even reached out to a local civil rights organization, hoping to get advice on how to handle the situation. The group was told to document every instance of harassment, and the organization promised to look into the matter. As the weeks went by, Ms. Gilmore's actions only grew more blatant. It was clear that she had made up her mind to get rid of the troublemakers in her class, and her frustration became more visible with every passing day. Her once well-controlled facade began to crack, and her anger would flare at the slightest provocation. One day, during a particularly tense class session, Ms. Gilmore lost her composure entirely. Mateo had corrected her on a historical date she had gotten wrong, and her reaction was immediate and fierce. "Do you think you're smarter than me, Mateo?" she snapped, her voice trembling with anger. "You're just another student who doesn't know their place." The classroom fell silent as the outburst echoed through the room. Nia could see the shock and confusion on her classmates' faces, and she knew that Ms. Gilmore's behavior was becoming harder to ignore. After class, Mateo pulled Nia aside, his expression grim. "We can't keep this quiet anymore. We need to bring this to the attention of someone higher up, or this will never end." Nia agreed, her determination steeling her. They decided to schedule a meeting with Mr. Campbell and Ms. Jacobs, bringing their documented experiences with them. They would present their case, hoping that this time, the administration would take their complaints seriously. The day of the meeting, Nia could feel her nerves buzzing, but she held her head high. She was joined by Mateo, Claire, and a few others who had been affected by Ms. Gilmore's behavior. Together, they walked into the principal's office, prepared to tell their story. As they recounted the incidents they had endured, Mr. Campbell and Ms. Jacobs listened intently, their expressions growing more concerned with each new detail. Nia could see the disbelief and shock on their faces, and for the first time, she felt like their voices were truly being heard. When they finished, Mr. Campbell leaned back in his chair, his face solemn. "I'm deeply sorry for what you've all experienced," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "This is not the kind of environment we strive to maintain here at Parkside, and I promise you that we will take immediate action." After their meeting with Mr. Campbell, Nia and her friends felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, things would finally change. Mr. Campbell's solemn tone and Ms. Jacobs' concerned nods had given them the impression that their voices had finally been heard. But they knew they had to be cautious, that promises and good intentions didn't always translate to immediate action. The next few days were filled with nervous anticipation. Ms. Gilmore's behavior continued to be hostile, and she showed no signs of backing down. In fact, she seemed angrier than ever, as though sensing the subtle shift of power beginning to slip from her grasp. Nia and her friends exchanged wary glances each day, wondering if or when the administration would step in. It wasn't long before the tension reached its breaking point. One Friday afternoon, during a presentation session, Miss Gilmore's frustration boiled over in a way that no one could have predicted. Nia and her classmates were working in small groups, presenting their findings on a research project they'd been assigned. When it was Nia's group's turn, she and her friends stood at the front of the room, ready to share their work. Just as Nia began speaking, Miss Gilmore interrupted her with a loud sigh. "Honestly, Nia, I expected better," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Is this really the best you could come up with?" Nia hesitated, her heart pounding. She'd put hours into this project, carefully researching every detail. "Ms. Gilmore, we spent a lot of time on this," she replied, keeping her voice steady despite her frustration. "I think our presentation covers all the required points." Ms. Gilmore narrowed her eyes, a smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Well, perhaps you're just not as competent as you think you are. But then again, I suppose that's to be expected." The thinly veiled insult hung in the air, and Nia's classmates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Mateo, standing beside Nia, took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Ms. Gilmore, I don't think it's fair to treat us this way," he said, his voice steady but filled with quiet resolve. "We worked hard on this, and we deserve to be treated with respect." Ms. Gilmore's eyes flashed with anger. "Excuse me, Mateo," she snapped. "Do you think you have the right to question me? I'm the teacher here, and if you can't handle constructive criticism, then maybe you should reconsider your priorities." The tension in the room was palpable, and Nia could feel the eyes of her classmates on her, silently urging her to stand her ground. She took a deep breath, channeling every ounce of strength she had. "Ms. Gilmore, this isn't constructive criticism. This is bullying," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "We're here to learn, and we deserve to be treated with dignity." A hush fell over the room. Ms. Gilmore's face turned red with anger, her eyes narrowing dangerously. "How dare you speak to me that way?" she hissed, her voice barely more than a whisper. "You think you're so clever, don't you? But let me tell you something, Nia, students like you don't get far in life. No one wants to deal with people who can't respect authority." Nia stood her ground, refusing to let Ms. Gilmore's words shake her. "I respect authority, Ms. Gilmore. But respect goes both ways. And I'm not going to stay silent when I see someone being treated unfairly." Ms. Gilmore's gaze shifted to the rest of the class, her voice rising as she addressed them all. "Is this what you all think?" she demanded. "Do you all believe that I'm treating you unfairly?" The class was silent for a moment, and then, one by one, students began to raise their hands. Mateo raised his first, followed by Claire, and then more and more hands went up, until nearly every student in the room was silently standing in solidarity with Nia. Ms. Gilmore's face was a mask of fury, and for a moment, it looked as though she might lose control entirely. But instead, she turned her back on them, muttering something under her breath as she stormed out of the room. The door slammed shut behind her, and the class was left in stunned silence. Nia and her friends exchanged looks of disbelief. They had stood up, all of them together, and it had been enough to make Ms. Gilmore back down, at least for now. Relief flooded through Nia, but it was quickly followed by a pang of uncertainty. She knew that this wasn't over, that Ms. Gilmore's absence was only temporary. After a few minutes, Mr. Campbell entered the room, looking uncharacteristically serious. "I heard there was an issue in here," he said, his gaze sweeping over the class. "Is everything all right?" Mateo stepped forward, his voice calm and measured. "Ms. Gilmore has been treating some of us unfairly," he said carefully, choosing his words with caution. "We just want to be able to learn without feeling targeted." Mr. Campbell nodded, his expression grave. "I understand. Thank you for telling me, Mateo." He turned to the class, his tone firm but reassuring. "I want you all to know that we take these matters very seriously. I'll be looking into this personally." With that, he dismissed the class, and they filed out of the room, still processing the events that had just unfolded. As they made their way down the hallway, Nia and her friends felt a renewed sense of determination. They had taken a stand, and their voices had been heard. Now, it was up to Mr. Campbell to follow through on his promises. The weekend brought a strange mixture of relief and anxiety. Nia tried to focus on her homework, but her mind kept drifting back to the confrontation in class, replaying Ms. Gilmore's words and the look of anger on her face. She couldn't shake the feeling that the storm wasn't over yet, that there were still battles to be fought. On Monday morning, as Nia walked into school, she was greeted by a few students she didn't know. "Hey, Nia," one of them called out, giving her a thumbs up. "You're awesome for standing up to her." Nia smiled, feeling a warm sense of pride mixed with trepidation. The school seemed abuzz with whispers and nods of acknowledgement. Her classmates were beginning to see her not as a target but as a symbol of strength and resilience. It felt empowering, but she knew it also came with a new level of responsibility. As she walked into her first class, she saw Ms. Gilmore standing at the front of the room. Nia's heart skipped a beat, but she took a deep breath and made her way to her seat, meeting Ms. Gilmore's gaze with a steady, unflinching stare. Ms. Gilmore's face was calm, but there was a steely glint in her eyes. It was clear that she was holding back her anger, her expression carefully controlled. "Good morning, class," she said, her voice tight. "Today, we'll be continuing with our discussion on Shakespeare." The lesson proceeded in tense silence, the entire class on edge as they waited to see how Ms. Gilmore would act. But she remained composed, her demeanor cold and professional, as though the events of the previous week had never happened. Nia couldn't shake the feeling that Ms. Gilmore was simply biding her time, waiting for the right moment to strike back. During lunch, Nia and her friends huddled together, discussing what had happened. "I don't trust her," Claire said, her voice low. "She's acting like everything's fine, but you can tell she's furious. I think she's planning something." Mateo nodded, his expression serious. "We can't let our guard down. She might be pretending now, but I bet she's just waiting for the chance to retaliate." Nia agreed, feeling the weight of their words. They had stood up to Ms. Gilmore, but it was clear that she wasn't finished. They would have to stay vigilant, to be ready for whatever came next. Nia entered her classroom that morning with a mixture of determination and dread, knowing that Ms. Gilmore wasn't one to let go of a grudge. Her friends, Mateo and Claire, were already at their desks, nodding reassuringly as she took her seat. They had all felt the mounting tension since their confrontation, and despite Mr. Campbell's assurances that the administration would intervene, Ms. Gilmore's demeanor had only grown colder. When Ms. Gilmore walked into the room, a stern silence fell over the class. She closed the door and began the lesson without a word of greeting. Her movements were stiff, and her tone was icy as she went over the day's assignments. The students watched her, wary of what might unfold. "Today, you'll be working on your group projects," she announced curtly. Her gaze swept across the room, lingering for a moment on Nia and her friends. "Since some of you have decided to question my methods, I'll be evaluating you even more closely." The underlying threat in her words was clear. Nia's hands tightened around her notebook, but she kept her expression neutral, refusing to give Ms. Gilmore the satisfaction of seeing her discomfort. The students broke off into groups, muttering among themselves as they prepared to start working. Throughout the period, Ms. Gilmore stalked through the room, stopping frequently at Nia's group. She would ask pointed questions, criticize minor details, and give harsh feedback. It was exhausting, but Nia kept her head down and focused, responding to Ms. Gilmore's criticisms with calm professionalism. The bell finally rang, and students began gathering their things, clearly relieved to leave. But as Nia was packing up her books, Ms. Gilmore's voice cut through the noise. "Nia, a word with you before you go." The room fell silent as the other students hesitated, glancing at Nia with concern. Mateo made a motion to stay behind, but Nia shook her head, silently telling him she could handle it. With a resigned sigh, she stepped up to Ms. Gilmore's desk. "Nia, I think you and I need to have a serious conversation about respect," Ms. Gilmore said, her voice low and icy. "You seem to think that you can defy me, that you're somehow above the rules of this classroom." Nia met her gaze without flinching. "With all due respect, Ms. Gilmore, I've been respectful. But I won't ignore unfair treatment." Ms. Gilmore's jaw clenched, and her eyes flashed with anger. "You've caused nothing but trouble in my class, Nia. I could have you removed from my class if I wanted to." Nia felt a surge of anger rise within her, but she forced herself to stay calm. "If you think that's best, then maybe you should go ahead. But I won't back down from what's right." Ms. Gilmore's face reddened, and for a moment, she looked like she might explode. But then, she simply turned away, waving a dismissive hand. "Get out," she muttered, her voice laced with frustration. Nia left the room with a mixture of relief and determination. She was tired of the constant battles, but she knew she couldn't give up now. As she made her way to the next class, she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of calm. She had stood up for herself, and that was something Ms. Gilmore couldn't take away. Over the next few weeks, the school administration became more involved in the situation. Mr. Campbell met with Nia and her friends again, assuring them that he was working to address the problem. Ms. Gilmore's behavior was now under close scrutiny, and she seemed to grow more frustrated with each passing day. Then, one afternoon, Nia was called to the principal's office. Her heart pounded as she walked down the hall, unsure of what awaited her. When she entered the office, she found Mr. Campbell and Ms. Jacobs waiting for her, along with Ms. Gilmore, who looked tense and visibly uncomfortable. "Nia, thank you for coming," Mr. Campbell said, gesturing for her to take a seat. "We've been reviewing the situation carefully, and after much consideration, we've decided to take action." Ms. Jacobs nodded, her expression sympathetic. "We're here to ensure that every student feels safe and respected in this school, and we take your concerns very seriously, Nia." Nia glanced at Ms. Gilmore, who avoided her gaze. She could feel the tension radiating from her teacher, but she kept her focus on Mr. Campbell. "Thank you, Mr. Campbell, Ms. Jacobs. I just want to learn in an environment where I'm respected." Mr. Campbell nodded. "We're committed to making that happen. As of today, Ms. Gilmore will be on a temporary leave of absence while we conduct a thorough investigation. In the meantime, another teacher will be taking over her classes." Nia felt a rush of relief and gratitude. She had hoped for a resolution, but she hadn't dared to imagine that things would change so quickly. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "I appreciate it." Mr. Campbell smiled warmly. "We appreciate your courage, Nia. It's not easy to stand up for what's right, but you've shown incredible strength." As she left the principal's office, Nia's mind swirled with a mixture of relief, disbelief, and cautious optimism. She had taken a stand, and it had made a difference. Ms. Gilmore's absence was a clear sign that her actions had consequences, and Nia felt a renewed sense of pride in herself and her friends for standing together. The days that followed were a whirlwind of change. The new teacher assigned to their class, Ms. Turner, was kind and approachable, and she treated each student with respect. Nia and her classmates quickly adjusted to the positive atmosphere, and for the first time in months, Nia felt excited to come to class. Mateo, Claire, and the rest of their friends shared her joy, and they often exchanged grateful smiles during class, relieved to be free from the oppressive presence that had once weighed them down. The experience had brought them all closer together, and they had formed a bond that went beyond the classroom. One afternoon, as Nia walked out of the school building, she found herself reflecting on the journey she had been through. She had faced adversity, stood up to injustice, and emerged stronger because of it. The support of her friends, her family, and the administration had given her the strength to keep going, even when things seemed impossible. As she left the school grounds, she saw Mateo and Claire waiting for her at the gate. They greeted her with smiles, and the three of them walked home together, chatting and laughing, their spirits lighter than they had been in a long time. Nia knew that there would always be challenges ahead, but she felt more prepared to face them. She had learned the power of her own voice, the importance of standing up for herself and others, and the strength that came from unity. And as she walked forward, she carried those lessons with her, knowing that she was capable of creating change, one step at a time.